Hello, my name is Sadia Hinedi, and today I will be presenting on my capstone project. It is a game demo titled Dread Knight VR. So what exactly is Dread Knight? Well, Dread Knight is a virtual reality-based dark fantasy-themed action RPG or role-playing game. To demonstrate the current state of my project, I have put together a very highly edited trailer to demonstrate some gameplay. Okay, so let me just return to slides. Having some technical issues with Miro right now. Okay. So why would I make this type of game in VR? Well, a big part of it is because I like to think about the philosophy behind video game design. Video games, according to video game writer James Newman, as he wrote in this essay, he argues, are not a fundamentally visual or even interactive medium. They're a kinesthetic medium, meaning that video games are all about the way that the experience makes the player feel. And therefore, the interactions and the visuals and the sounds and all those components of the games, it's not that they're unimportant, but all of those things are actually in service of the kinesthetic element, which is how does the player feel when they play this game. And I felt that with a kind of darker themed game, setting it in virtual reality adds an extra layer of kinesthetic experience to it. It creates a kind of experience that I don't think can be replicated without the use of VR. So the gameplay philosophy that I went for is based off of this idea of emergent gameplay. Emergent gameplay, according to this definition, is that games that don't have a specific story to tell, but offering many potentialities of stories to be experienced by the player. So one example of this in practice would be a game like Minecraft. It's a game that is designed with a set of core mechanics in mind, and the narrative of the game isn't something that's structured, but rather is something that arises out of the gameplay mechanics themselves. So how does this work? Well, the first step is that I'd have to start by implementing a gameplay mechanic. So one thing that I asked myself was, you saw an axe in that trailer. What if the player could use their axe to chop wood in the game? Okay, so if I implement the mechanic, then I start thinking of further possibilities that could be enabled by the mechanic. So think of possible interactions that are enabled. Well, what if the tumbling lumber happened to crush some poor enemies who are standing under it, right? So now, next I think, okay, well, couldn't I design my level to enable different paths of interaction? So I could use the axe to cut down an enemy, as you saw in the trailer, or alternatively, I could actually take the axe, cut down some wood, and then watch the wood fall on them. And here I have an example of what that could look like in practice. this is from my game. As you can see, you can cut through the wood right here. And you can keep cutting it and cutting it almost infinitely. Here's an enemy which you can kill with the axe. Same time, there are some zombie enemies down there. If you cut the wood falls on them and deals damage. The idea behind this type of gameplay philosophy is to allow for, as I said, multiple possibilities of gameplay experience. Player has two options with their axe. They can either fight the enemy head on, or they can exploit a feature of their environment to their advantage. So the visual aesthetic I went for was based off of dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is also alternatively called grimdark, but I prefer to just call it dark fantasy. It's a subgenre of fantasy media that focuses more on the darker elements of a fantasy world. It's much like horror in that it presents a terrible, even terrifying reality, one a reader can immerse themselves in but escape from easily simply by closing the book, or in this case, taking off a headset, VR headset. It can distract us from our own terrible, seemingly terrifying reality, comfort us, and even provide some interesting lessons. So some examples would be A Song of Ice and Fire or the Game of Thrones books, which have a lot of elements of dark fantasy. Video games such as the Warhammer games have a dark fantasy theme, and games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls, which involve fighting a lot of undead enemies. So lighting and designing a dark fantasy world. So a lot of the inspiration I took comes from other dark fantasy video game titles such as Dark Souls, a game by From Software. On the left, you have the first level of Dark Souls after the tutorial area, and it is a famous area called the Firelink Shrine. On the right, you have the starting area from my game called Dread Knight, and I didn't create all of these art assets. I did purchase them from the Unity store, but I took those props and some of the torches and adjusted like some fog volumes and lighting settings and arranged everything to try to recreate the look and the feel and the color palette of games such as Dark Souls. I wanted an authentic Undead Slayer experience. With the assets I chose, I was very much inspired, like I said, by other dark fantasy titles, such as A Game of Thrones. For those who have watched the later seasons, and I will try not to spoil anything, these kind of zombie enemies called the White Walkers appear. And for this set of assets that I purchased and used for the project, I chose this set of assets because this undead right here has these kind of very, very light blue, almost inhuman looking eyes. And I wanted to replicate that kind of aesthetic in the game. As you can see, here's a skeleton enemy that is featured in the game, very similar to these White Walkers you see. And I decided I wanted to try to evoke that aesthetic within my project. This right here is a fight sequence from Game of Thrones, and this is a fight sequence with an axe from my own game. Lastly, to create that authentic dark fantasy experience, you need the right weapons. a common trope of this type of fantasy is the hero has very powerful fantasy weapons such as large swords and large axes, and this is a set of weapons that are available on the Unity Asset Store that I thought would go very well with the aesthetic and with the fog volumes and with the map. I tried to create an eerie, foggy, and a spooky look in mind. So the game is very much a work in progress, but going forward, I'd like to add more features such as an inventory system and more UI to enable the player to gather and allocate experience points and resources gained from fighting enemies and exploring the world. I'd like to create a more in-depth magic system and add more variety of playstyles, such as using archery, magical staffs, and other melee weapons. And my goal is to one day release a game that people will be as excited to play as I was to make it. And I'm open to answering any questions about my project. If you would like to post them in the comments or send them to me. Thank you.